Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the kind of war you definitely wouldn't survive. Not the grand armies of history, not tanks and trenches, but the first tribal wars, where death came as silently as a blowgun dart in the dark. From arrows tipped with beetle venom that made you collapse slowly over hours. 2 skulls hung from rafters as fertilizer for next year's crops. 2 women and children taken not as spoils but as living strategies for reshaping the future. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange, unsettling dives into the past. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love knowing who's out there with me in this little ritual of history and insomnia. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour some tea, or let a fan hum softly in the background. Settle in, because we're about to walk into a world of poison, ambushes, and fear, and you'll want to keep looking over your shoulder. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one fumbling with Wi-Fi passwords and trying to remember if you left the stove on, but the one born into a world where conflict resolution didn't mean couples therapy. It meant a spear in the ribs. If you'd been unlucky enough to arrive in a tribal society before standing armies, before flags and uniforms, your childhood wouldn't have been marked by birthday parties but by whispered stories of raids, who attacked whom, who took whose pigs, and whose uncle got skewered while planting yams. Congratulations, you've just entered the original neighborhood watch, and the watch involves poison-tipped arrows. You see, the first tribal wars weren't about ideology or flag-waving patriotism. Nobody was arguing over parliamentary votes or the subtleties of tax reform. These wars were over things far simpler and far sharper: land, cattle, water, insults, sorcery, accusations, and good old-fashioned revenge. Think of it as the ancient version of Twitter feuds, but with fewer hashtags and more disembowelments. Someone stole your fishing net. That's a raid. Someone suggested your shaman's rain dance looked suspiciously ineffective. That's another raid. Violence was cyclical, like the seasons, except this season came with more screaming. And unlike the cinematic nonsense you've seen on screen, tribal warfare wasn't about grand armies charging across open plains. That's a later invention, crafted by people who had the luxury of surplus grain and full-time soldiers. Here, war was personal, local, and never really over. You didn't win tribal wars. At best, you postponed the next ambush until everyone's cousins had healed from spear wounds. The dead rarely numbered in hundreds. 5 or 6 corpses were plenty to shatter a village of 30, which means that statistically, you'd probably end up either a body on the ground or a relative plotting the next raid. Don't be fooled into imagining this as chaotic though. Tribal warfare was structured, even the Yanomami of the Amazon, for example, often began disputes with chest-pounding duels, 2 men standing toe-to-toe whacking each other in the sternum until one keeled over. That was round 1. If that didn't resolve the matter, round 2 escalated into club fights, and if egos still weren't satisfied, well, then it was time to reach for the poisoned arrows and the night raids. Papua New Guinea Highland clans did something similar. Arguments spiraled from shouted insults to arranged battles in the fields, which inevitably broke down into messy ambushes in gardens and pig pens. Violence had choreography, until it didn't. And because these wars weren't fought by professional armies, everyone was involved. Warriors didn't march off to distant battlefields, while women waved goodbye from porches. No, wars came straight to your door, more precisely, to your yam garden. Men carried spears, women screamed curses to unnerve the enemy. Children learned early to spot the difference between friends and raiders in the tree line. You didn't grow up wondering if you'd ever travel the world. You grew up wondering if you'd live to see the next planting season. Now, here's the unsettling truth. The percentage of violent deaths in many tribal societies was higher than in the world wars of the 20th century. Yes, modern people with machine guns and tanks killed millions, but proportionally, small-scale societies lived with more danger. In some Amazonian groups, as many as 20 to 30% of adult males died from warfare. Imagine if a third of your neighborhood was gone not because of old age, but because someone down the river muttered that your clan's ancestors were liars. That's not a statistic, that's a blood-soaked lifestyle. So if you'd been born there, into the fragile balance of tribal life, every glance, every insult, every suspicion of sorcery could spiral into violence. And you wouldn't just be a spectator. No, you'd be drafted from birth into the endless carousel of fear and retaliation. That was the context. That was the world. And it only gets darker when you realize how these wars were actually fought. And since you're already living in a world where peace is basically just the pause between raids, let's talk about how those raids actually happened. Spoiler, you didn't get a noble trumpet call announcing the enemy's arrival. Nobody marched in with banners waving and gave you time to put on your war paint. No, the first tribal wars were built on the art of ambush, which means if you'd been there, your odds of survival depended less on bravery and more on whether you could hear a twig snap in the dark. Ambush was everything. In dense Amazonian forests, warriors crept barefoot, their skins smeared with dark pigment, moving as silently as smoke. They didn't shout, they waited. They let you come to them, into the clearing, into the river bend, into the garden where your back was bent low over cassava plants. Then the arrows sang. Not 100, just enough. 2, 3, 4. Each tipped with poison, each meant to cripple, not just wound. You'd barely register the sting before your legs betrayed you, and your enemies melted back into the trees, leaving chaos in their wake. Papua New Guinea highland clans were just as fond of ambushes. Imagine walking along a mountain path, the sun heavy on your shoulders, pigs grunting in the distance. You stop to tie your sandal made of bark fiber, and then whack, a stone club drops from behind a rock. Not a fair duel, not a test of strength, a strike to the skull, fast and unannounced. Because in tribal war, survival wasn't about heroics, it was about trickery, patience, and knowing that the enemy was probably watching you right now. And that's what makes ambushes so terrifying. It wasn't the scale of the violence, it was the unpredictability. The Maori of Aotearoa, New Zealand understood this perfectly. They built fortified villages, precisely because they knew that an attack could come when warriors were away fishing, when children were gathering firewood, when old men were telling stories. Security was less about walls and more about suspicion. You trusted nobody, not even the silence of the forest. Let's not pretend you'd fare well in this world. You, with your predictable morning routine, scrolling in bed before brushing your teeth. In tribal warfare, routine was a liability. If you fetched water from the same stream every day at dawn, congratulations, you'd just scheduled your own execution. Ambush punished predictability. The most paranoid survived. Which means if you'd been there, you'd spend your life moving in zigzags, peering over your shoulder and wondering if that rustle in the bush was a rabbit or your cousin's cousin, come to avenge a decades-old insult. And here's the kicker. Ambush wasn't just military efficiency, it was spiritual. The attack itself was often accompanied by chants, war cries, or even deliberate silence to unnerve the victims. Among the Yanomami warriors smeared their bodies with black dye before a raid, believing it turned them into spirits of the forest, invisible hunters. To be ambushed wasn't just to be surprised, it was to be reminded that the human world and the spirit world conspired together against you. So if you're still imagining yourself as a brave warrior, let me stop you. You wouldn't be charging into glorious combat, spear raised high. You'd be bending over your garden one moment and bleeding in the dirt the next. Tribal war wasn't about glory. It was about catching you when your hands were full, your back was turned, and your gods were looking elsewhere. And just when you thought that was bad enough, when the forest itself felt like it was plotting your downfall, your enemies had another secret weapon. One far worse than silence and surprise. They had poison, because it wasn't enough to be stabbed, speared, or clubbed from behind. No, in the earliest tribal wars, your enemies wanted to make sure that even if they missed the vital spot, you'd still end up gasping for air under a tree. That's where poison came in. If ambush was the tactic, poison was the insurance policy. And let me tell you, you wouldn't have survived that either. Take the Amazon, where the Yanomami and other groups used sounds exotic, almost like a trendy smoothie ingredient, until you realize it's a neurotoxin that paralyzes your muscles while you stay perfectly awake. Imagine being shot with a tiny dart, just a prick. You shrug it off, thinking you've brushed against a thorn, but then your legs don't work. Then your chest tightens. Then you're lying on the forest floor, eyes wide open, aware of everything but powerless to breathe. That's how warriors made sure you didn't get back up to tell your side of the story. Across the world in southern Africa, the San were masters of beetle poison. They harvested toxins from the larvae of Diamphidia beetles, smearing it onto their arrow tips. These weren't instant kill weapons. No, they were slow, creeping death. You'd stagger for hours, maybe even days, the venom clotting your blood, making every step feel like fire. There's something almost poetic about that cruelty. Even if your enemy didn't catch you in the raid, the poison would finish the job as you limped home. A delayed death sentence, hand-delivered by an insect. Southeast Asia had its own arsenal. Warriors used the sap of the Anti-Aris toxicaria tree, a latex so potent that even a scratch on the skin could stop the heart. Polynesians sometimes smeared spear points with toxins derived from pufferfish or cone snails, just to make sure the wounds turned fatal. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about certainty. Poison turned even the smallest dart into a guarantee. And don't for a second think these people didn't understand the science. They knew exactly how to extract, store, and apply these toxins without killing themselves. In the Amazon, poison was carefully boiled, thickened, and tested on small animals before it was ever used in battle. Beetle toxins were harvested seasonally, passed down like recipes. You think your grandmother's soup is a family secret? Try your great-grandfather's beetle poison. That was the heirloom worth guarding. But here's the part that would have undone you. Poisoned weapons meant you couldn't take chances. You didn't need to be run through the chest to die. A scratch on the arm, a graze across the thigh, a dart that barely broke the skin, all fatal. There was no "it's just a flesh wound." Every wound was potentially lethal, and the fear of that made warriors cautious, twitchy, and paranoid. That's the real power of poison, not just in the killing, but in the anticipation of being killed. And of course, this wasn't just physical warfare, it was spiritual. Poison was believed to carry not just chemical potency, but metaphysical weight. In many cultures, shamans blessed the poison, linking it to spirits, curses, and ancestors. To be poisoned wasn't just to die from a chemical, it was to be marked by supernatural judgment. So imagine yourself back then, crouched in the undergrowth, spear in hand, thinking you're prepared. But the moment the dart hits your skin, you'd realize the fight was already over. You weren't a warrior. You were a body waiting for the poison to finish its work. And if poison didn't get you, the next danger certainly would. Projectiles flying out of nowhere, invisible until it was too late. So, you've managed to avoid the ambush and miraculously dodged the poison. Don't celebrate just yet, because now comes the real fun. Projectiles. You see, tribal wars weren't fought up close, with clanging swords like in your medieval fantasies. They were fought at a distance, with little things you couldn't see until they were already inside you. In the Amazon, it was the blowgun. Long polished tubes carved from palm wood, sometimes stretching 6 or 7 feet, that could launch a dart silently through dense forest. The darts were so thin they were almost invisible, sharpened to a whisper, and dipped in curare for good measure. Imagine strolling down a forest path, minding your own business, and then, PFFT, something brushes your neck. You wouldn't even know you'd been hit until your knees gave out. The warriors didn't need to rush you. They'd just wait, hidden in the undergrowth, while the poison did its work. Silent weapons, silent deaths. Across Africa, bows and arrows were equally unforgiving. Not the Hollywood kind with sleek curves and taut strings. These were short, compact hunting bows, perfect for ambush, firing small arrows designed to wound first and kill slowly. Some were tipped with iron, others hardened in fire, and many carried toxins that made even a scratch a death sentence. Shields existed in some regions, sure, but what good was a hide-covered plank when the shot came from the dark at an angle you never saw coming? Papua New Guinea. Spears ruled there. Light-throwing spears balanced for accuracy, sometimes hurled in volleys. You'd hear the whistle before the pain, but by then it was already lodged in your thigh. And here's the irony. They weren't necessarily trying to kill you outright. Wounding was often better. A wounded enemy slowed down his group, cried out in pain, and turned an ambush into chaos. Fear spread faster than arrows. And then there was stealth. Projectiles weren't just weapons, they were theater. Warriors painted themselves in dark dyes, camouflaged with leaves and mud, and moved as shadows. They struck from treetops, from riverbanks, from behind rocks. No matter how sharp your eyes, you couldn't catch them all. Every rustle, every bird call became suspect. A blowgun's whisper was quieter than your breath. A bowstring's snap was lost in the chorus of insects. The real genius, though, was psychological. The weapon wasn't just the dart or the spear. It was the not knowing. You could walk through the forest for days, untouched, until one morning the air cracked, and your cousin was on the ground with a shaft through his chest. The uncertainty hollowed you out, made you jump at shadows, drained your courage before the enemy even arrived, and don't think you'd fare any better. You raised in a world where conflict is mostly words on screens, wouldn't last an afternoon where death came at you invisibly. There are no second chances when the weapon is already in flight, before you even know you're in a war. And here's where it gets darker. If the arrows and darts didn't kill you, the fear of them would, because fear wasn't just a byproduct of tribal war, it was a weapon all by itself. By now, you've been ambushed, poisoned, and shot at. But here's the thing, even if you somehow dodged all that, you'd still be finished, because fear alone would eat you alive. And in tribal wars, fear wasn't just an unfortunate side effect, it was part of the arsenal. The most efficient weapon wasn't always the spear or the dart. It was the gnawing certainty that they could come for you at any moment. Raids often happened at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground and your brain hadn't caught up with your body. That was deliberate. Attacking when eyes were blurry and hands clumsy amplified panic. Night raids were even worse. You'd wake to the crack of a hut burning, the scream of a neighbor, the unmistakable whistle of arrows. In pitch black, you couldn't tell who was attacking whom. That confusion was the real battlefield. And if you think fear of the dark is childish, remember that in these societies it was perfectly rational. Darkness was where enemies thrived. But fear wasn't only in the timing. It was cultivated in sound. Some Amazonian groups used war cries, deep, guttural, almost animalistic, not because it helped them fight, but because it made you hesitate. A pause, a heartbeat, was all they needed. In other places, silence itself was the tactic. Imagine walking in a forest that's usually alive with insects and birds, and suddenly everything goes still. That silence wasn't nature. That was warriors holding their breath, waiting. You'd feel it crawl across your skin before the first arrow even flew. And if you were Polynesian, fear often came with drums, a steady beat that wasn't just rhythm, it was intimidation, psychological warfare echoing through valleys. A reminder that the enemy was organized, awake, and coming. Fear was atmospheric. It painted the world around you in menace, long before the spear tips broke the tree line. The cruelest part. Fear lingered. Even when no raid came, you lived with it. You didn't plant your crops without glancing at the tree line. You didn't bathe in the river without imagining eyes on you. You didn't even sleep deeply, because dreams could be interrupted by the hiss of fire and the pounding of feet. Constant vigilance was survival. Relaxation was death. And don't kid yourself, you'd crumble under it. You, whose biggest scare is the notification ping of an overdue bill. Fear in tribal wars wasn't a spike of adrenaline. It was a permanent companion. It changed how you moved, how you ate, how you raised your children. Fear became cultural. It was passed down in stories, in rituals, in whispered warnings around the fire. Because fear didn't just prepare you for battle. It shaped your identity. You weren't simply a farmer or a hunter. You were a potential target, a walking piece in a game where survival required suspicion. And in that game, even the gods got involved, because fear wasn't merely psychological, it was spiritual. Shamans read omens, warriors sought blessings, and every tremor in your stomach was explained as the spirits themselves urging caution, which means you didn't just live afraid of people, you lived afraid of the unseen, and the unseen was always worse. But fear had to be managed, given shape. And that's where the spiritual side of warfare took over, where battles weren't only fought with weapons, but with gods and ancestors whispering through the fire. Because when fear was everywhere, in the silence of the forest, in the flicker of the fire, in the whisper of the grass, you needed someone to blame or someone to bless. And that's where the spiritual side of warfare slipped in. You see, tribal wars weren't just skirmishes between humans, they were dialogues with the cosmos. If you went into battle without the ancestors, you might as well go in naked. Every arrow fired, every spear lifted, carried more than wood and stone. It carried prayer. In the Amazon, warriors would sit in smoky huts with shamans, who inhaled hallucinogenic snuff to commune with spirits. Those visions weren't optional. They told you whether tomorrow's raid would succeed, or if the enemy's ghosts were already sharpening their teeth. If the omen was bad, the raid might be postponed. Because why risk your skull when the spirit world had already declared you dinner? Papua New Guinea was no different. Before battle, Men decorated themselves with feathers, bones, and ochre, transforming their bodies into canvases of the supernatural. These weren't fashion choices. Each line of paint linked them to clan ancestors, totem animals, and unseen allies. Step into combat without paint, and you weren't just underdressed, you were spiritually naked, defenseless against curses and sorcery. And sorcery was everywhere. In many societies, defeat wasn't chalked up to poor tactics, but to witchcraft. Maybe the rival clan's shaman had cursed your pigs, or someone in your own camp whispered treachery into the spirit world. This wasn't paranoia, it was cosmology. The physical and spiritual worlds were tangled threads, and war tugged on both at once. In Polynesia, war priests played an even bigger role. They invoked gods, conducted rituals, and dictated when battles could begin. Sometimes they even carried sacred objects into the fight, staffs, stones, or feathers believed to channel divine power. A spear thrust wasn't just muscle, it was backed by the weight of gods. Lose the fight. Clearly, you'd angered those gods. Win, proof you were chosen. Either way, it wasn't just your reputation at stake, it was your place in the cosmic order. Now, imagine yourself there. You're sitting with the war party the night before a raid. The fire is low, the shaman is humming, and everyone's staring at the bundle of charms tied to your ankle. Do you believe? It doesn't matter. Belief isn't optional. If you show doubt, you don't just risk your own skin, you risk breaking the ritual protection for everyone. Congratulations, you're now both an unbeliever and a liability. And liabilities had a way of disappearing before dawn. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Here you are, supposedly preparing for a fight with spears and arrows, and half your energy is spent negotiating with the invisible. Because in tribal war, the unseen was as lethal as the visible. Spirits tipped arrows, ancestors steadied hands, gods judged outcomes. And if you thought the enemy was scary, wait until you realized your own ancestors might sabotage you for a forgotten offering. So you painted your body, tied charms to your waist, and whispered to the dead, not because you wanted to, but because everyone knew the battlefield wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, and your survival depended on walking into combat draped in spirits. But of course, once you'd dressed your soul, you still had to dress your body, and that's where ritual preparations took over, turning warriors into walking masks, painted threats, and living terrors. So, you've appeased the spirits, muttered your prayers, and agreed not to laugh when the shaman sneezed mid-ritual. Good. But before you could even think about stepping onto the battlefield, you had to transform your body into something unrecognizable. Because ordinary flesh wasn't enough. You needed to look like terror itself. Paint was the first layer. In the Amazon, warriors rubbed their skin with genipapo, a dark dye that left the body ghostly blue-black, or with uricum, a red pigment as bright as fresh blood. This wasn't just aesthetics. Red made you a living omen, a walking symbol of danger. Black made you look like a shadow, half spirit, half human. And let's be honest, a line of silent red-painted men emerging from the tree line would probably make you wet yourself faster than the arrow would. Papua New Guinea took it further. Warriors adorned themselves with bird of paradise feathers, boar tusks, shells, and ochre smeared in spirals. They didn't look like men anymore. They looked like nightmares stitched from forest and bone. Their hair was stiffened with clay to make halos around their heads, their bodies draped in bark belts and leaves. This wasn't camouflage, it was intimidation, a moving theater of fear. You weren't just fighting men, you were fighting creatures who looked like they'd crawled out of myth. And here's the acid humor. The more terrifying you looked, the safer you felt. Paint and costume were as much psychological armor as they were decoration. You, trembling with your modern wardrobe of cotton t-shirts and sensible shoes, wouldn't stand a chance. Imagine painting your body head to toe in sticky black dye, strapping feathers to your arms, and stepping into battle believing you'd turned into a hawk spirit. You can barely handle face paint at a music festival, but it wasn't only about scaring the enemy. Body paint also marked identity. Patterns said who you were, what clan you belonged to, which ancestors you carried into battle. Paint was a language. If you went in bare-skinned, you weren't just vulnerable to arrows, you were unmarked, unanchored, suspicious. Who fights without ancestors painted on their chest? Nobody trustworthy, nobody alive for long. And then came the rituals. Warriors often fasted before battle, purging themselves of weakness. Some inhaled smoke or drank infusions to sharpen courage, blur fear, or invite visions. In certain Amazonian groups, the war party huddled together, blowing tobacco smoke onto each other's bodies, blessing one another with the scent of fire and leaf. In the highlands of New Guinea, men danced and stamped before battle, raising dust clouds, turning adrenaline into performance. You couldn't just fight, you had to perform readiness, embody power, show your enemies and your allies alike that you were already possessed by the will to kill. And if you refused, if you dragged your feet, smeared your paint half-heartedly, skipped the chance, well then, you weren't simply lazy, you were dangerous. A half-prepared warrior put the whole group at risk. So maybe you'd wake up painted anyway, your companions forcing the dyes onto your skin, chanting around you whether you liked it or not. Consent wasn't part of the ritual. Survival was. So, step back and picture it. A line of bodies painted red like fresh wounds, black like midnight, feathers quivering in the air, tusks gleaming, eyes wide and staring. They weren't simply men anymore. They were apparitions. You, watching from the safety of modern life, would already be undone. Because the first tribal wars weren't just fought with weapons. They were fought with transformation, with turning human flesh into terror itself. And once you'd become that painted, masked, no longer yourself, the point wasn't just to fight. It was to take, to capture, to turn war into cycles of revenge, and bodies into trophies. So there you are, painted and feathered, feeling half human and half nightmare. You think the point of this whole terrifying makeover is just to kill. But no, sometimes killing was the least important part. Because in the first tribal wars, captives were the real currency. And if you had the bad luck to be caught instead of killed, congratulations, you just became someone else's political pawn, ritual offering, or dinner guest in the worst possible sense. Take the Amazon again. Among groups like the Tupinamba in Brazil, raids weren't just about resources. They were about revenge, and captives fed that cycle. Enemies were taken alive, tied up, and marched back to the village where, after months of ritual taunting, they might be executed in public, not out of sadism, but to balance the scales of honor. Killing wasn't random, it was bookkeeping. Blood had to match blood. Your death wasn't about you. It was about some cousin you'd never met, killed in a raid years before. Imagine dying not for your own deeds, but because your genealogy happened to align with someone else's grudge list. In Papua New Guinea, captives were absorbed differently. Sometimes they were adopted into the victorious clan, replacing lost relatives in swelling numbers. Sometimes they became bargaining chips in negotiations, hostages to guarantee peace that almost never lasted. And in darker cases, they were executed or even eaten, not for calories but for power. Consuming an enemy's flesh wasn't about food. It was about absorbing strength, courage, spirit. You wouldn't have survived long enough to explain that you weren't gluten-free. And here's the cruel twist. Being taken alive didn't mean you were spared. In fact, it often meant your death would be slower, ritualized, a spectacle for others to witness. Your captors didn't just kill you. They made you into a story, a lesson for children, a warning for rivals, a feast for ancestors. The longer you lived, the more symbolic weight you carried. Until one day, when your death finally came, it was staged like theater, and everyone applauded except you. Revenge was the fuel that kept these wars burning. Someone kills your uncle, you retaliate, but retaliation itself creates a new grievance. Suddenly, their nephews are obligated to avenge, and their nephews' nephews. The cycle never ends. It spirals outward until entire generations are locked into obligations of blood. You weren't born free. You were born into debt, a blood debt that had to be paid whether you wanted to or not. If you refused, you dishonored your ancestors. And in societies where ancestors watched everything, dishonor was just as fatal as a spear. You, imagining yourself as a modern pacifist, would have been eaten alive, metaphorically at first, literally later, saying, "Can't we all just get along?" Wasn't a neutral statement, it was treason. Refusing revenge meant betraying kin, rejecting obligation, and leaving your community vulnerable. Peace wasn't an option you could just declare. It was a fragile pause between obligations, waiting for the next spark. So picture it. You're painted, trembling, dragged into the enemy's village, surrounded by dancers who chant your impending death. You're not a person anymore. You're a placeholder in a cosmic ledger, filling in the balance of blood. And even if you thought you could argue your way out, you couldn't. because no one in that circle cared about you. They cared about what you represented: revenge, honor, restoration. And of course, if they didn't kill you, they might have other plans involving women, children, and the reshaping of entire families. You might think the brutality of tribal war stopped at warriors clashing in the forest, but no, the real devastation reached the hearth. Because in small-scale societies, women and children weren't bystanders. They were the prize, the target, and sometimes the excuse for entire wars. If you'd been there, survival wouldn't just depend on avoiding arrows. It would depend on whether you were considered useful enough to take alive. In East Africa, cattle raids often doubled as bride raids. Maasai, Turkana, and others fought not only for livestock but for women, who represented both reproductive power and alliances. A woman captured meant children in the next generation, who carried your blood instead of the enemy's. Marriage here wasn't always negotiated over drinks. Sometimes it was hammered out with spears, the bride price paid in blood. Imagine being courted by a war party that showed up at dawn with poison-tipped arrows. Tinder never looked so polite. The Amazon offers even darker stories. Raids often targeted women deliberately, not simply as spoils but as tools of humiliation. To take a man's wife was to shame him, to weaken his standing, to ensure the next child didn't belong to his lineage. In some cases, captured women were adopted into the new community, becoming mothers, sisters, or wives. Others, less lucky, were killed outright to erase enemy bloodlines completely. Either way, women were never outside the battlefield. They were the battlefield, and the children, targets, too. Among the Yanomami, children were sometimes abducted, raised by the victors as replacements for their own dead. Adoption could be assimilation, creating bonds that blurred lines between friend and enemy. But other times, children were killed precisely because they represented future warriors. Wipe them out, and you weakened tomorrow's resistance. You, who grew up with baby photos in albums, would have been another statistic in someone else's strategy. Even in Polynesia, warfare often revolved around securing women and children to swell numbers in competitive island environments. Populations were small, survival precarious, and the fastest way to grow your clan wasn't waiting around for fertility rituals to work. It was taking the reproductive labor of someone else's. War wasn't just about the present. It was about seeding the future, forcibly if necessary. And here's the bitter humor. All of this was seen as logical, rational, necessary. Taking women wasn't framed as cruelty but as restoration. Killing children wasn't evil, it was efficiency. No court, no Geneva Convention, no headline outrage, just another raid completed, another tally in the cycle of survival. Now picture yourself, living in that world. If you were a woman, you weren't asked. Your destiny was tied to the spears and ambitions of others. If you were a child, you didn't grow up with the luxury of innocence. You grew up as a potential asset or a potential threat. Imagine trying to play in the dirt while adults whispered about whether you'd live to see another sunrise. And this wasn't incidental. It was strategic, because to destabilize a rival, you didn't just kill warriors. You shattered their homes, scattered their families, and rewrote their future generations. That was the logic of tribal war, not just ending lives but reshaping lineages. And of course, all of this hinged on the most basic of needs: food, water, animals, land. Which means that beneath the painted faces and spiritual rituals, many wars began over something much more ordinary: resources. Strip away the feathers, the paint, the poisoned darts, and the chance, and what are you left with? The same thing that fuels half of human conflict: stuff, food, land, animals, water. Forget ideological wars or holy crusades. The first tribal wars were supply chain disputes with sharper teeth. And if you'd been there, your family garden, your fishing line, or your goats were enough to spark bloodshed. In the Amazon, fertile patches of land and hunting zones were flashpoints. A clan sets its manioc fields by the river. Then another clan complains the fish are fewer because of it. Soon, what started as an argument about cassava pancakes ends with poisoned arrows in someone's chest. Crops weren't luxuries, they were life. Lose a patch of soil, and you didn't just lose dinner, you risked extinction. Pastoralist societies in Africa made it even clearer. Cattle were wealth, status, and future rolled into one. Raiding for cattle wasn't a crime. It was practically a career path. Among the Dinka, Nuer, and Turkana, Young men proved themselves by seizing cows from rivals. No cows, no wives, no linaje. If you couldn't raid, you couldn't reproduce. That means you, with your weak arms and Netflix-conditioned thighs, would have been single forever, not because you lacked charm, but because you lacked stolen livestock. Papua New Guinea clans fought over pigs with the same ferocity. Pigs weren't just food, they were currency, spiritual symbols, and keys to alliances. Raiding the enemy's pig pens wasn't simply theft, it was economic sabotage. One well-executed pig raid could humiliate rivals more deeply than spearing 3 warriors. A famine might starve you slowly. A pig raid starved your reputation immediately. And water, let's not forget water. In arid or semi-arid regions, wells and rivers were lifelines. One clan blocks access, another starves of thirst. Suddenly, a muddy stream isn't just a stream. It's the border between survival and annihilation. Wars didn't need grand causes. They just needed a dry season. Here's the twisted humor. While you imagine yourself noble, brave, painted red, and chanting under the moon, the actual trigger for half these raids might have been, they took our yams. Or, they stole 5 goats. Entire cycles of violence, kidnappings, deaths, ambushes, rooted in disputes that, to your modern ears, sound like petty theft. But for them, theft wasn't petty. It was existential. And of course, resources weren't just about survival. They were about pride. Control of fertile land, rich fishing waters, or herds of cattle wasn't only practical. It was prestige. You weren't respected just because you painted your body and waved a spear. You were respected because you had the land to plant, the pigs to feed, the cows to parade, the rivers to fish. Resources didn't just feed mouths, they fed egos. So imagine it, you wake before dawn, proud of your small garden plot, your herd of scrawny goats, your access to a decent patch of river. By evening, those goats are gone, your neighbor is dead, and you're left explaining to your children why you didn't avenge the insult. The cycle begins again, all because someone wanted your cucumbers. And the cycle didn't stop at theft. Because once raids were done, once resources were taken, there came another layer of brutality. The trophies, the displays, the human bodies turned into proof of victory. You'd think raids over yams, pigs, or goats would be enough. Steal the food, take the cattle, drag off a few captives. Job done, right? Not quite. Because in tribal warfare, victory didn't count unless it was displayed. And display wasn't a polite PowerPoint slide or a flag planted in the dirt. It was bones, heads, scalps, and trophies arranged so that everyone living, dead, and divine could see. Take the Naga of northeast India. They were famous for headhunting. A warrior wasn't truly a man until he'd taken an enemy's head. That skull wasn't just proof of strength, it was a spiritual resource. It was believed to bring fertility to the fields, health to the village, and prestige to the warrior's lineage. Imagine explaining that to your kids. Yes, dear, the reason the rice is growing so well is because Uncle Cato just beheaded a man by the river. Practical farming advice, brought to you by decapitation. In Papua New Guinea, skull houses with a communal Instagram. Enemy heads were strung up, displayed like decorations, sometimes even polished, painted, or smoked for preservation. They weren't rotting corpses, they were symbols, conversation starters, visual proof that your clan was strong enough to terrify others. And let's be honest, nothing screams "don't mess with us" quite like a wall of skulls grinning from a doorway. Scalping, too, had its place. Across North America, scalps were taken as portable trophies, easy to carry, dramatic to show off. They weren't random souvenirs, they were status markers. A scalp could prove bravery, frighten enemies, and give the taker supernatural strength. You, fumbling with your smartphone camera to document your dinner, wouldn't have stood a chance in a world where proof of victory was measured in strips of human skin. But the brutality wasn't just for the enemy, it was also for your own people. Displays cemented your reputation at home. A man who returned empty-handed, no head, no trophy, no proof. He was whispered about, laughed at, shamed. Better to die with a head in your hands than to live with empty ones. And women, children, elders, they all saw the trophies, learned the stories, memorized the cycle. Violence wasn't hidden. It was architecture, woven into the village itself. The irony, of course, is that this wasn't senseless cruelty. It had rules, meanings, a twisted logic. A head wasn't just a head. It was a vessel for power, fertility, legitimacy. A skull hanging from your roof beam didn't just terrify outsiders, it reassured insiders that balance had been restored, that honor had been repaid, that the ancestors were satisfied. Now imagine yourself returning from battle, not with medals pinned to your chest, but with a dripping head swinging from your hand. You'd place it carefully in the skull house, whisper a prayer, maybe smear some paint across it, while your clan nodded approvingly. Congratulations, you've just fertilized next season's crop with someone else's cranium. And here's where the real horror creeps in. Displays weren't just about celebrating victory. They were about ensuring the cycle continued. A head on a pole was an invitation. It shouted to enemies, "We've taken one of yours," which meant the next raid was already guaranteed. Brutality wasn't closure, it was advertisement. And living under that constant advertisement, war on you. Because every head taken, every scalp displayed, was another reason to expect retaliation. Fear didn't fade, it deepened. And soon, fear itself became the daily rhythm of life, carved into the bones of your village. By now, you've got skulls dangling from rafters, scalps drying in the sun, and pig raids turning into vendettas. But let's talk about what that did to your mind. Because the first tribal wars weren't just waged with spears and poison, they were waged in your head, every hour of every day. And the truth is, you wouldn't have survived the waiting, the worrying, the slow drip paranoia that saturated everything. Villages weren't built just anywhere. They were perched on hills, hidden in forests, surrounded by palisades. Defensive architecture wasn't decorative, it was daily necessity. The Yanomami cleared large patches in the jungle for their circular communal houses, always scanning the edge for enemy movement. In the highlands of New Guinea, hamlets were built on ridges, with steep drops on every side, not for the view, but for the tactical advantage. A picturesque sunrise also doubled as an early warning system. Travel was never casual. Forget Sunday strolls or aimless wandering. Every step outside the village was a calculated risk. Go too far without a group and you might not come back. Traders moved with escorts, farmers looked over their shoulders, and children learned early to tell the difference between bird calls and enemy whistles. Leisure was practically extinct. Suspicion filled the gaps where peace might have been. And here's the exhausting part. Even when no raid came, you lived in a state of constant readiness. You couldn't relax, because relaxing was dangerous. A woman collecting firewood in the wrong place could trigger a raid. A boy herding pigs too close to enemy territory could spark a feud. In small-scale societies, one wrong move wasn't just an accident, it was a political event. The irony, statistically, actual combat didn't happen every single day. Raids were episodic, ambushes sporadic, but the fear was permanent. It filled the silence, rewired your body, made adrenaline your daily companion. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon once described the Yanomami as living in a chronic state of warfare, not constant battle, but constant readiness for it, which, arguably, is worse. You can endure a fight, you can't endure never knowing when the next fight will come. So imagine yourself in that state. You go to sleep with a spear by your side. You wake up to check if the pigs are still there. You glance at your neighbor, wondering if he's as loyal as he looks. Even your laughter is cautious, cut short by the possibility that someone, somewhere, is plotting. And no, you don't get therapy, you get rituals. You get shamans blowing smoke at you and elders muttering that vigilance is the only cure. Children grew up under this psychological weight. They learned suspicion before they learned games. They practiced hiding as much as hunting. Childhood wasn't a sanctuary, it was training for paranoia. And if you think your anxiety over unanswered emails is bad, try growing up knowing your cousin's death last year means you're statistically next in line for a raid. Fear carved itself into your bones, generation after generation. It wasn't just emotional, it was cultural, architectural, agricultural. It shaped how houses were built, how fields were planted, how friendships were made. In a world of tribal war, suspicion wasn't neurosis, it was survival. And yet, beneath all this vigilance, something else lingered. Death didn't come in floods of thousands. It came in handfuls. But those handfuls, over time, hollowed out entire communities. Small scale, but constant. Which meant you were always one raid away from watching your world collapse. Here's the cruel math of it all. Tribal wars didn't rack up the body counts of modern armies. No oceans of corpses, no entire cities leveled. But don't let that fool you. The violence was smaller in scale, yes, but proportionally, it was devastating. In some societies, as many as 1 in 5 adult males died from warfare. That's not occasional tragedy, that's a lifestyle. Think about it. World War II killed millions, but proportionally, fewer people per capita died than in some small-scale societies. In the Amazon, anthropologists found communities where 25% of men had their lives cut short by raids or revenge killings. In Papua New Guinea's highlands, battles over pigs or sorcery could drag on for generations, leaving cemeteries filled faster than gardens replanted. You, sitting smug in your modern life, think small-scale means safer. It didn't. It meant everyone was in the blast zone. Because here's the difference. In a tribal war, the death of just 5 people could gut a community. Imagine a village of 30. 5 gone in a single raid. A father, a brother, a husband, a son, maybe a child, and suddenly the balance of everything collapses. Who plants the fields? Who defends the house? Who raises the pigs? Losing 5 people in New York City wouldn't even make the news. Losing 5 in a small clan was an existential catastrophe, and it wasn't just numbers, it was who died. Tribal battles weren't fought by retirees. They took the young, the strong, the men in their prime, the ones needed for protection, reproduction, and survival. Every death wasn't just a body lowered into the ground. It was a hole punched through the future of the clan. The ripple was endless. Wives without husbands, children without fathers, crops without caretakers. You couldn't just recruit replacements. A society that small had no bench. The constant churn of death created a rhythm of grief that never really stopped. Mourn one cousin, and by the time the paint fades from your face, another cousin's gone. Funerals weren't isolated moments, they were routine, and each funeral came with an expectation, revenge, which meant mourning wasn't the end of the cycle, but the trigger for the next raid. Here's where you wouldn't stand a chance. You're used to thinking of grief as private, maybe therapeutic, maybe even healing. But in these societies, grief was gasoline. The wails of women weren't just mourning, they were battle cries, stoking the men to avenge the dead. Your sadness wasn't meant to soothe, it was meant to sharpen. And if you dared suggest peace, if you whispered, "Haven't we lost enough already?" Congratulations, you've just been labeled a coward, maybe even a traitor. And the irony, nobody won. No side ever truly erased the other. The violence trickled, dripped, recycled itself endlessly. Nobody wiped out an entire people. They just kept cutting away at each other, like 2 men locked in a knife fight, too weak to kill, too proud to stop. Death was constant, but never conclusive. So picture it, not mass graves, not armies colliding, but one raid here, one ambush there, month after month, year after year. By the end, you weren't living a life. You were surviving an attrition. And survival wasn't just physical. It had to be negotiated, sealed, ritualized, which meant war needed its own ceremonies of ending, even if those endings never really lasted, because even endless cycles of revenge needed an occasional pause. You couldn't just kill forever, not because anyone suddenly discovered morality, but because exhaustion, famine, and sheer numbers forced people to hit the brakes. And so, tribal warfare developed its own endings, or rather, temporary ceasefires dressed up as cosmic theater. If you'd been there, you wouldn't have found treaties signed on parchment. You'd have found pigs exchanged, blood spilled in oaths, and marriages hammered together with as much enthusiasm as a hostage negotiation. In Papua New Guinea, for example, highland clans sometimes ended wars with mocha, elaborate gift exchanges, usually involving pigs. One group might slaughter dozens of pigs, pile them high in front of the enemy, and say, "Here, this pays the debt of blood." Except it wasn't just generosity, it was theater. The bigger the pile, the more prestige for the giver. Your dead cousin was replaced, in theory, by roasted pork. Imagine grieving a brother and being told to smile because, hey, the enemy just gave you 20 pigs and a very enthusiastic yam. Elsewhere, peace was sealed with marriage. Among pastoralists in Africa, clans that had raided each other for cattle and women eventually married into one another, binding the feud with kinship ties. Nothing says sorry for killing your uncle quite like handing over your daughter as a peace offering. And if you're wincing, good. Because for women, these arrangements weren't romantic reconciliations. They were logistics. The female body became the treaty itself, traded 2 glue clans back together after they'd torn each other apart. The Amazon had its own rituals. Some groups practiced ceremonial feasts where former enemies ate and drank together, pretending for a moment that years of violence could be washed down with fermented manioc beer. The rituals were carefully staged, weapons left outside, shamans humming, chants rising. But make no mistake, the truce was fragile. One wrong word, one insult to sharp, and suddenly the feast turned back into a raid. And of course, there were blood oaths. Warriors cut themselves, mingled blood, swore to the spirits that vengeance was satisfied. Symbolically, the clans were no longer separate. Their blood flowed together, until, inevitably, someone's cousin got speared in the garden again, and the oath was conveniently forgotten. Here's the bitter humor. These peace rituals weren't resolutions. They were timeouts. Everyone knew the cycle would continue. The pigs would eventually die. The marriage alliances would sour. The blood oaths would fade. But for a moment, just a moment, life could return to something resembling normal. Crops could be planted, children born, rituals performed without the constant drum of war. Now picture yourself at one of these ceremonies. You've lost relatives. You've painted your body, carried spears, buried your dead. And now you're expected to sit across from the very people who killed your brother and share roasted pork, nod politely while their chief talks about cosmic balance. You'd either choke on rage or choke on the meat, neither of which would impress the ancestors. But this was the rhythm. War, revenge, pause, feast, war again. Peace was never permanent. It was performance. And while the rituals tried to end cycles, what they really did was keep them spinning smoothly, like oiling the gears of conflict. And even with these rituals, the toll on bodies and minds never really stopped. Because death and fear, repeated endlessly, carved deep into communities, leaving scars that shaped every story, every tradition, every whispered warning round the fire. And that legacy, the legacy of fear, poison, ambush, and revenge, is what we still carry, quietly, in the marrow of our species. So here you are, at the tail end of the cycle. You've seen the ambushes, the poisoned darts, the painted warriors, the heads dangling from rafters, the pigs traded like bloody receipts, and you're probably wondering, what's left? What lingers after all the raids, the fear, the revenge? The answer is simple: legacy. Because the first tribal wars never really ended. They just reshaped how humans think about conflict, suspicion, and survival. Anthropologists have long pointed out that small-scale societies suffered proportionally higher rates of violent death than industrialized ones. Think about that. In your cushy modern life, you can die of cholesterol or boredom. Back then, odds were good you'd die because someone 20 huts away thought your shaman's rain dance looked suspiciously ineffective. Violence wasn't random, it was structural, embedded into kinship, land, resources. And we've carried that habit with us. The legacy lives in how humans organize. Defensive architecture, still here, just with concrete walls instead of palisades. Suspicion of outsiders, alive and well, now dressed up as politics and border control. Even the trophies, once skulls, now medals, statues, selfies with flags planted in enemy capitals. We've dressed it up, polished it, made it look respectable, but at its core, it's the same old song. Fear, retaliation, performance. And here's the part that stings. Those small wars taught us that violence is sticky. Once it starts, it rarely resolves. It breeds memory, obligation, trauma. Whole lineages in the Amazon still tell stories of raids that happened decades ago, as if they were yesterday. In Papua New Guinea, rival clans still dig up grievances over pigs stolen in the 1960s. The war may stop. The stories never do. And stories are just wars waiting for fresh blood. Even our modern states, with armies and treaties, still echo the patterns. Wars don't just kill. They reshape kinship, redraw resources, rewrite futures, and peace, still fragile theater, signed at tables instead of sealed with pig feasts, but no more permanent. You live in a world that pretends to have evolved past tribal wars, but look closely. The ghosts of poison, ambush, and revenge are everywhere, just dressed in suits and uniforms. If you'd been born into those early cycles, you'd have lived suspicious, died young, and been remembered not as yourself, but as someone's obligation for vengeance. And if you think you've escaped that by being modern, well, look around. The legacy of tribal war isn't gone. It's sitting in the marrow of our species, whispering that conflict is natural, fear is smart, and survival means looking sideways at everyone else. So the truth, you wouldn't have survived the first tribal wars, not because you'd have been too slow or too soft, though that's true, but because nobody really survived them, not fully. Whole societies carried the scars forward, passing them down, reshaping them, hiding them under new costumes. And we're still carrying them, even now, pretending our wars are different when really, they're just louder echoes of the same old poison and fear. Pain, oddly enough, was never seen as the enemy. It was the sculptor. Where we might talk about building character with books and extracurriculars, many societies were more honest. They built character with knives, whips, and the kind of ordeals that left you walking differently for the rest of your life. Pain was the passageway that turned a boy's soft body into a vessel for war. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, but a deliberate, almost mechanical process. Endure the burn, the cut, the hunger, endure anything at all, and you were no longer a child. Fail, and you remained a half-formed thing, still lingering on the threshold of society, tolerated but not trusted. Anthropologists like to call this liminality, but the boys didn't need vocabulary. They had the language of swollen joints, cracked lips, and open wounds. The very idea was that without surviving something sharp, bloody, or humiliating, the body wasn't properly fitted to carry weapons, nor the mind tuned to face dying without flinching. The boy had to be stripped of the softness that life had allowed him so far. And what stripped more effectively than pain? The harsh logic behind these trials made sense in a world where enemies weren't theoretical. Communities that practiced warfare didn't have the luxury of raising children slowly. They needed replacements, and they needed them trained in the currency of suffering. A man who'd never bled on purpose was considered unreliable in the moment of battle. A man who had screamed too loudly under the lashwell, that echo would carry with him for years. Pain wasn't just endured, it was remembered by everyone else as a kind of social receipt, and the memories didn't fade quietly. They were carved, sometimes literally, into the skin, which brings us, unavoidably, to the matter of scars, those silent signatures that announced, before a word was spoken, who had walked through fire and who had merely warmed their hands by it. Scars worked like ink, only sharper. Where writing fades and parchment rots, a scar stays stubborn, refusing to be erased. Among many groups, a boy's first cuts weren't accidents of clumsiness, but orchestrated events, small lines carved into arms, chests, or shoulders, pressed with ash or clay so they healed raised, thick, impossible to miss. Each mark spoke, I endured this, and I didn't cry loud enough for anyone to mock me later. In parts of Africa, boys sat in circles while elders drew blades across their skin, each slice laid with the precision of a craftsman carving wood. The point wasn't decoration. The point was to build a map that everyone could read at a glance. A scarred chest wasn't just a chest, it was a resume. Those who bore it became living documents, their bodies carrying proof that they had been tested and found, unbreakably, or at least, unbroken enough. And there was beauty in it too, though it's hard to call the process beautiful. Raised patterns across the body turned skin into a kind of armor, not functional against spears but effective against doubt. You didn't have to announce your toughness. It was embossed on your flesh. There's a cruel efficiency in that. Why keep a written archive of bravery when you can simply glance at a man's torso and know he had once clenched his teeth while someone cut lines into his boyhood? The pain, in truth, was never meant to end with the cut. Infection was almost expected, fevers welcomed as secondary tests. If you lived through both, you had earned more than a scar. You had earned survival itself. And survival, in this context, was the only certificate that mattered. Of course, not all societies trusted scars alone. Flesh could lie, after all. Scars heal, and a coward might still bear them. Which is why many added a second layer of assurance. Beatings, drawn out until the boy's endurance or collapse was witnessed by everyone who mattered. The lash was less a punishment than a classroom. In some societies, boys were lined up and whipped until their skin tore, not because anyone thought they had sinned, but because pain was the curriculum. In ancient Sparta, for instance, the boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia were flogged in front of cheering crowds, sometimes to the point of collapse, sometimes to the point of death. The audience didn't flinch, they measured character in the number of blows endured without a scream. Elsewhere, the beatings came from peers, not priests. Among certain Pacific groups, older initiates would strike the younger ones with sticks, clubs, or open hands, a brutal game that wasn't really a game at all. The lesson wasn't just to endure pain, but to endure it together. Suffering shared in silence became the glue that tied boys into a unit. What use was a warrior who could handle his own pain but folded when he saw his comrades suffer? The ordeal was as much theater as trial. Elders watched closely, women whispered judgments, and the entire community knew which boy fainted, which clenched his jaw, and which carried the bruises proudly into the next day. Endurance under the lash became a kind of currency. Fail once, and the story lingered longer than the bruise. Success, on the other hand, was a badge. You didn't have to wear it, was told and retold in other people's voices. What's striking is how carefully these rituals blurred the line between cruelty and necessity. The beatings weren't random. They were measured, staged, calibrated to break just enough. Break the skin, break the breath, but not the body beyond repair. Pain was rationed like food, too little and it didn't teach, too much and it wasted a life that could have been a soldier. And when the bruises faded, there was always another trial waiting. Some were less visible, quieter, but no less cutting. The long, gnawing hunger of being sent away with almost nothing and told to survive anyway. Exile was the quieter cruelty. A boy, barely more than skin and nerves, sent off with nothing but a knife. Or sometimes not even that, left to wander into forests, deserts, or mountains where the wind itself seemed to sneer. Hunger arrived first, an ache that grew sharp, then dull, then sharp again. Thirst followed, turning the tongue into cracked leather. The ordeal wasn't about finding food or water quickly though. It was about enduring the hours before they appeared, about facing the thought that they might never appear at all. Among certain indigenous groups in North America, boys were sent to fast alone, waiting for days until a vision came, hunger and exhaustion becoming a doorway to revelation. Elsewhere, in the Arctic and subarctic, isolation wasn't mystical so much as practical. Survive the cold night alone, and you've proven you can keep breathing even when nature itself seems determined to erase you. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. If you couldn't outlast solitude and starvation, how would you outlast battle? Loneliness was part of the medicine. The silence of the wilderness pressed in like a second skin, stripping away childhood chatter. Nights stretched into hours, where every crack of a branch could be a predator, every shadow a spirit come to test the boy's nerve. Survival wasn't just about meat and water, but about keeping your mind from collapsing in on itself. The true scar left by isolation wasn't on the skin, but in the way the boy learned to carry fear like a companion. When they returned thinner, hollow-eyed, sometimes trembling, they weren't greeted with pity. They were measured. How long had they lasted? What had they seen? Did they cry out for rescue, or did they walk back on their own? In a sense, hunger became the first enemy they defeated. Yet hunger wasn't the only enemy sharpened into a ritual. The body itself, tender and pliable, could be stripped of pieces, teeth, blood, sometimes whole fragments of flesh hauled up as the price of joining the world of men. Teeth were often the first to go. Not by accident, not in a fight, but by design. A boy might be held down while an elder gripped a sharpened stone or a crude chisel, knocking out an incisor or two in a single brutal motion. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, missing front teeth weren't a sign of poor dentistry. They were the visible proof that childhood had been pried out of the mouth and discarded. Every smile, every word spoken afterward carried the echo of that moment. Bloodletting was another favorite curriculum. Among the Maya, noble boys pierced their tongues or genitals with thorns or obsidian blades, offering their own blood as a kind of tax to the gods. It wasn't just a private matter, but a public performance. Endurance without a flinch meant a boy wasn't merely ready for battle, but also for the spiritual obligations that came with rank. Across the Pacific, boys had veins opened deliberately, blood dripping into the earth, as if to root their bodies into the soil of their people. The loss wasn't an accident. It was a rehearsal for the battlefield, where bleeding without panic could mean survival. And then there were the more permanent sacrifices. A finger segment taken, a piece of skin cut away, an ear nicked. Among some Australian Aboriginal groups, the removal of a tooth or the circumcision of a boy was staged as a ritual death. The body altered so thoroughly that returning home, he was no longer recognizable as the same person. Pain was the sculptor. but flesh was the clay, carved and reshaped into something society could trust with weapons and wives. The shock of these ordeals was the point. By tearing something away, the community declared, "This boy will never again be what he was." Childhood, unlike a tooth, couldn't be grown back. Still, pain wasn't always sharp and bloody. Sometimes it arrived through fire in the veins, visions spilling across the eyes, hallucinogens, and poisons that turned boys inside out, convincing them they were dying so they could learn what it meant to survive. Smoke, roots, and bitter brews. Sometimes the most punishing ordeal wasn't a lash or a blade, but a sip. Among Amazonian groups, boys swallowed concoctions so vile they vomited for hours, their stomachs heaving until their bodies trembled like reeds in wind. The purge was intentional, weakness expelled, childhood spat onto the dirt, and after the sickness came the visions, bright, terrifying, unavoidable. Certain hallucinogens tore away the veil between waking and nightmare. A boy might see jaguars crouching in the shadows, or hear the voices of ancestors whispering in his ears. These weren't hallucinations to be laughed off, they were lessons staged in the theater of the mind. If you panicked, if you screamed and clawed at the air, you weren't ready. A warrior had to hold himself steady, even as the world bent sideways. The terror wasn't just endured, it was studied. Among the Tucano in the northwest Amazon, Yajo ayahuasca was taken under the supervision of elders, the boy vomiting and trembling while his mind broke open. In Papua New Guinea, Datura and other toxic plants were fed to initiates until their bodies stiffened, their pupils blown wide. The ordeal wasn't a spiritual vacation, it was a rehearsal for death. Boys learned what it felt like for the body to betray them, to collapse, to stumble through the darkness of their own mind. And when the visions passed, they returned, not unscathed, but sharpened, convinced they had glimpsed the spirits who would walk with them into battle. The real test wasn't what they sit, was how they carried themselves through it. Crying out, flailing, or running marked you as unreliable. Remaining still, silent, or at least coherent, made you worthy. Terror was supposed to teach composure, the same composure expected when spears and arrows began flying, which leads naturally to the obsession with silence itself. Endurance was important, but endurance without a sound, that was the gold standard. Boys were expected to keep their mouths shut while pain gnawed at their nerves, turning stoicism into a weapon sharper than any blade. Silence was the crown jewel of endurance. Bruises faded, cuts healed, but one scream could follow a boy for life. In cultures where war was always waiting at the horizon, men who groaned or begged under ritual pain were marked as brittle. The body could take 1,000 lashes, but if the mouth betrayed weakness, the boy's reputation cracked beyond repair. In parts of West Africa, initiates had their skin sliced or burned, while elders stood by, watching for the smallest tremor of sound. A hiss through clenched teeth, a whimper. These weren't just embarrassing, they were catastrophic. Among the Spartans, silence was an obsession. The flogging at Artemis Orthia wasn't just about blood, it was about proving you could hold yourself like stone. To cry out was worse than fainting. Better to collapse in a pool of blood than to emit a single scream. It wasn't only physical pain that demanded quiet. During isolation fasts, boys were expected to keep their voices low, sometimes forbidden from speaking at all for days. Words were withheld like food, silence itself a discipline. To speak too soon, to whine for help, was to prove that the tongue hadn't yet been tamed. A warrior's mouth, after all, was supposed to deliver commands, threats, or battle cries, not confessions of fear. The irony is almost cruel. Children naturally cry, complain, seek comfort. These trials carved that out of them. A boy who could take a blow without a sound was no longer fully a boy. He was stepping into a language of silence understood by men who fought and bled together. And because silence alone couldn't crown him, the ordeal always needed witnesses. Pain had to be seen, catalogued, remembered. Otherwise, endurance was wasted in the dark. Which is why every ritual, whether cuts, fasting, or flogging, unfolded beneath the eyes of the community. Nothing was ever done in secret. Pain, to count, had to be witnessed. A boy's initiation wasn't a private drama between him and his nerves, it was a spectacle arranged for the eyes of others. Elders stood at the center, of course, measuring every twitch and tremor, but the crowd could be broader. Women might linger at the edges, whispering judgments. Children watched to see the fate that waited for them. Men, already scarred and proven, judged whether the newest crop of boys were worth standing beside in battle. Among the Xhosa in southern Africa, circumcisions took place with elders and peers gathered around, all eyes fixed on the boy's face. Any flicker of weakness was stored away in the memory of the community, whispered about long after the wound healed. In ancient Sparta, the flogging of youths at the altar wasn't a hidden ordeal but a festival event, with whole crowds cheering or mocking, depending on the silence of the victim. Endurance was never private, it was a public currency, and everyone kept the ledger. The presence of witnesses transformed pain from an individual burden into a communal contract. To endure in silence proved loyalty to the group. To fail publicly wasn't just personal shame, it was a breach of trust. What good was a warrior who screamed at the lash when others would have to rely on him in the chaos of war? The ordeals sorted them, visibly, undeniably, and those memories were sticky. Years later, scars might fade to faint lines, but the stories didn't. An old man could be reminded of the time he fainted under the knife, just as another was remembered for never uttering a sound even while his teeth were knocked out. Oral societies had long memories when it came to blood and courage. Yet the spectacle was more than judgment. It was theater, ritual, a symbolic script in which a boy's old self died before everyone's eyes, and a new self walked forward in his place. Which is why the next step always involved a kind of staged death, the body remade, the boy symbolically buried, then brought back as someone entirely else. Death rehearsed itself in countless disguises. In some places, boys were taken away under the cover of night, stripped of their names, painted with ash, and declared dead to their families. Mothers wept, as if at funerals, not because their sons were gone forever, but because the children they had raised would never return in the same form. What walked back after the ordeal wasn't a son, it was a warrior, a stranger, a man sealed by suffering. Australian Aboriginal initiations often played this theatre of death with precision. A boy might be seized suddenly by elders, carried off screaming into the bush, subjected to circumcision or tooth removal, then hidden for weeks. To the community, he was dead. To himself, he was in limbo. Only after enduring the trials was he reborn, led back, painted in ochre or covered in clay, no longer belonging to the soft world of children. Elsewhere, symbolic burials were common. In parts of Papua New Guinea, boys were smeared with mud, confined in darkness, or forced to lie in pits like corpses. In Amazonian groups, the ingestion of poisons that mimicked death, the body collapsing, convulsing, stiffening, served the same symbolic function. They learned, in miniature, what it felt like to die, and having faced that threshold, they returned untouchable. Men who had already crossed death once and come back. The imagery wasn't subtle. Childhood had to be killed so adulthood could take its place. Pain was the executioner, ritual the gravedigger, and the community the witness. The boy's old identity was buried in the cuts, the hunger, the silence. What emerged afterward was considered permanent, irreversible. But death plays tricks across generations. As colonial powers and world religions spread, many of these rituals were outlawed or shamed into extinction. Yet the logic, the stubborn belief that manhood must be tested through suffering, never disappeared. It simply changed costume. Colonial authorities and missionaries were appalled by these trials. Of course, the floggings, the bloodletting, the tooth extractions all struck them as savage interruptions to what they thought of as civilized life. Laws were written, ceremonies banned, boys sent to schools instead of initiation camps. Pain, as a social contract, was supposed to be erased. Yet the erasures never fully worked. Cultures that had long relied on these rites sometimes carried them underground, disguised them as festivals, or translated them into less bloody gestures. The body remained a canvas. The knife, though dulled, was never entirely put away. And when traditional forms faded, modern ones rose in their place. Armies built their own curricula of suffering, endless drills, forced marches, boot camps designed less to teach technique than to see who could keep moving after their feet split open. Hazing rituals in schools and fraternities echoed the same logic: inflict pain, demand silence, watch closely who breaks and who belongs. Even in sports, the obsession lingers. Boys pushed to exhaustion, praised for broken bones endured without complaint. Different settings, same grammar of endurance. The continuity is striking. Whether through ritual scars or military bruises, societies have carried forward the belief that pain is the forge where warriors are made. The old symbolic deaths have given way to new ones, hair shorn in barracks. Recruits stripped of names, men remade, not with blades but with shouted commands and sleepless nights. But something lingers in the older ways, something uncomfortably honest. A scar carved with a stone, a tooth knocked loose, a boy hidden in a pit until his breath slows. These didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were: rehearsals for death, payments for entry into the dangerous fraternity of men. Modern versions disguise themselves as discipline, as training, as bonding. The older rituals made no such excuses. They told the truth out loud. To be a warrior is to suffer first, so that when real death comes, it doesn't find you unprepared. They rarely thought of a battlefield as a mere patch of dirt. It was prepared, almost curated, like a theater stage awaiting its actors. The ground itself might be sprinkled with ash, smeared with animal blood, or marked with carved stakes that hummed with meaning to those about to fight. To the uninitiated it might look like nothing more than ritual fussing. But in the eyes of warriors, this was the scaffolding of order. Chaos was coming, yes, but chaos had to be dressed in ceremony first. Among the Aztecs, combat was not war in the European sense, but a kind of extended sacrifice. Prisoners were often taken alive because the gods craved their hearts more than their corpses. Battles unfolded like pageantry, complete with costumes, drums, and a choreography that blurred war with theater. The same could be said of the ancient Greeks, who swore their oaths before bloodshed, libations poured onto the soil, so the gods might witness. If death was inevitable, then let it unfold on a stage where heaven and earth could both applaud. Even further east, in Japan, a duel between samurai wasn't always a messy brawl. It was almost liturgical. Armor polished, banners raised, introductions made. The field became less a place of slaughter than an altar of identity, where honor had to be demonstrated with the same precision as a priest handling relics. Fighting wasn't simply about who would live or die. It was about proving, in front of witnesses, human and divine, that the act itself carried weight beyond mortality. The battlefield, in this sense, was more shrine than soil. It's no accident that many wars began only after sacred signs were read, entrails examined, eclipses interpreted, the whispers of birds noted in silence. Without this framing, bloodshed was just murder. With it, violence became a dialogue with gods who never spoke, but always demanded. And once the ground was consecrated, the tools of death could be raised, which is where weapons themselves stopped being mere steel or wood, and started functioning as divine instruments, channels of a will that exceeded their owners. They rarely thought of a battlefield as a mere patch of dirt. It was prepared, almost curated, like a theater stage awaiting its actors. The ground itself might be sprinkled with ash, smeared with animal blood, or marked with carved stakes that hummed with meaning to those about to fight. To the uninitiated, it might look like nothing more than ritual fussing, but in the eyes of warriors, this was the scaffolding of order. Chaos was coming, yes, but chaos had to be dressed in ceremony first. Among the Aztecs, combat was not war in the European sense, but a kind of extended sacrifice. Prisoners were often taken alive because the gods craved their hearts more than their corpses. Battles unfolded like pageantry, complete with costumes, drums, and a choreography that blurred war with theater. The same could be said of the ancient Greeks who swore their oaths before bloodshed, libations poured onto the soil so the gods might witness. If death was inevitable, then let it unfold on a stage where heaven and earth could both applaud. Even further east, in Japan, a duel between samurai wasn't always a messy brawl. It was almost liturgical. Armor polished, banners raised, introductions made. The field became less a place of slaughter than an altar of identity, where honor had to be demonstrated with the same precision as a priest handling relics. Fighting wasn't simply about who would live or die. It was about proving, in front of witnesses, human and divine, that the act itself carried weight beyond mortality. The battlefield, in this sense, was more shrine than soil. It's no accident that many wars began only after sacred signs were read, entrails examined, eclipses interpreted, the whispers of birds noted in silence. Without this framing, bloodshed was just murder. With it, violence became a dialogue with gods who never spoke but always demanded. And once the ground was consecrated, the tools of death could be raised, which is where weapons themselves stopped. being mere steel or wood, and started functioning as divine instruments, channels of a will that exceeded their owners. Once the soil had been prepared, it was the turn of the weapons. They were never just tools of violence. A spear was an arm stretched toward the gods, a sword the tongue of divinity, speaking through iron. Across cultures, weapons carried a weight that blurred craftsmanship with sorcery. Bronze blades in the ancient Near East were cast, not only with molten metal, but with whispered prayers. Each strike of the smith's hammer believed to drive a charm into the edge. Among the Norse, swords received names, not nicknames, but identities, and were expected to behave like personalities. To drop such a weapon in battle was not an accident, but a betrayal, as if one had abandoned a companion rather than an object. In West Africa, ironworkers were treated almost like priests for this very reason. They coaxed power out of earth and fire, giving it back in the form of blades that could pierce not only flesh but fate. Even shields bore symbolic charge. A Roman scutum wasn't simply wood and leather. Painted on its face were emblems that transformed it into a portable cosmos. To stand behind it was to be enveloped in the order of Rome itself, as if the empire were holding you in its arms. For the Maori of New Zealand, clubs carved from jade paunamu were not bludgeons but ancestors reborn in stone, each swing connecting genealogies as much as breaking bones. There was also a belief that the weapon, once consecrated, chose its wielder. A bow that snapped, a spear that splintered. These were read as omens, messages that the gods had revoked their favor. The warrior became little more than a vessel. The edge, the point, the shaft, the weight, all of it was alive in a way that went beyond the trembling hand holding it. But of course, weapons weren't meant to stay clean. Their true meaning revealed itself only when blood appeared, thick and steaming, the stain that turned tools into offerings. Blood was never an accident on the battlefield. It was the expected currency of the arrangement. If weapons were the messengers, then blood was the message. Nothing spoke louder to gods, spirits, or ancestors than the sight of warm crimson soaking into the earth. Across continents, blood was thought of less as a fluid and more as a currency, life condensed into liquid form, to be spent, spilled, or exchanged. The Aztecs believed the sun itself required blood to keep rising, and the battlefield was just another altar under open sky. Every pierced chest, every slit throat, was less about victory than payment, an installment to keep the cosmic cycle from grinding to a halt. In Homer's tales, the Greeks sacrificed captives at funerals, letting blood drip onto the pyres so that the dead might walk into Hades with companions. Even among the Scythians of the Eurasian steppes, drinking the blood of the first enemy slain was not sadism but initiation, anointing the warrior in the essence of life, stolen. Blood was sticky, yes, but it was also radiant with meaning. To smear it on one's face was to become marked by the divine. To let it pool beneath the feet was to nourish the soil that would later bear crops. When early chronicles describe soldiers wading ankle-deep in gore, they aren't just recording horror, they're hinting at an unspoken satisfaction, a sense that the ground had been properly fed. Even wounds themselves became symbolic. A gash across the chest could be read as a sacred opening, a literal door in the flesh where spirits might enter or exit. Some warriors refused to bind such wounds immediately, believing the slow leak was a prayer in liquid form. Pain was the tax of devotion, and blood its most eloquent language. But of course, this offering wasn't just about what left the body, it was also about what the body itself became. Once scarred, painted, or tattooed, the warrior's skin told a story far louder than words, transforming him into something more shrine than soldier. The body was never just a container for muscle and bone. Once marked, it became an altar in motion. Scars weren't accidents of combat, but inscriptions, a script written in flesh. Among the Dinka of Sudan, lines carved across the forehead turned pain into permanence, the warrior's face becoming a tablet of initiation. In Polynesia, entire bodies were inked with patterns that wrapped skin like armor, each curve and spiral transforming men into living genealogies. The wounds of combat, the tattoos of ritual, the paint smeared before a fight, all of these announced that the body wasn't only a participant in violence but its shrine. There were also moments when the body became more than marked, it became possessed. Warriors in trance, whether through rhythmic drumming, intoxicating brews, or sheer exhaustion, often described feeling seized by powers outside themselves. Zulu warriors spoke of battle frenzy that stripped away hesitation. Norse berserkers foamed at the mouth, as though Odin himself had borrowed their muscles for a few hours. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To insiders, it was divine hospitality. This transformation carried into death as well. In cultures where falling in battle guaranteed a heroic afterlife, the Norse Valhalla, the Japanese ideal of dying with honor, the body itself was already halfway gone before it touched the ground. A corpse on the battlefield wasn't just a casualty. It was a vessel now claimed by forces larger than family or tribe. The warrior's body ceased to be personal and became collective, belonging to gods, to ancestors, to story. But even before death, flesh announced its purpose. A body daubed in ochre, feathered, scarred, or pierced was a warning and a prayer at once. This skin is no longer ordinary. It has been prepared. It is ready. And so when two such vessels met in combat, the duel was never merely about survival. It was a cosmic miniature, a distillation of war into two bodies, colliding like stand-ins for whole worlds. When two bodies met in a duel, the field around them seemed to shrink. The clamor of armies, the roar of drums, even the screaming of the wounded, fell away until all that remained was the space between two figures. An arena so small it could fit inside a heartbeat, yet vast enough to decide the fate of kingdoms. The duel was never just about two men testing skill. It was a ritual condensation of war itself. Among the Celts, champions stepped forward before battles, trading blows while their clans held their breath. Whoever won didn't just earn glory. He set the tone for the larger conflict, his strike echoing across the field as if gods themselves had offered a verdict. In India, the Mahabharata describes warriors meeting like cosmic forces, Arjuna and Karna, circling each other as if the entire universe had leaned in to watch. And in the sagas of Iceland, blood feuds narrowed into single duels at dawn, the frost crunching underfoot as fate shrank to the size of two bodies in the mist. The duel was theater and divination combined. The Greeks called it Bolamakwa, one fight, one destiny. When Achilles faced Hector before the walls of Troy, it was less about who swung harder and more about whose god had sharper teeth that morning. One death was never private. It tilted the scales of whole cities, shifting myths as easily as it toppled flesh. Spectators, too, understood this compression. They didn't just cheer, they watched with a reverence close to prayer, as though staring at a living oracle. The duel was a miniature cosmos, order versus disorder, light against shadow, one world collapsing into another. And when the killing blow landed, the silence afterward was often heavier than the death itself. But the duel was never purely pragmatic. It was spectacle. It was choreography. Which is why the language of combat so often spilled into the language of dance, each swing and dodge belonging as much to ritual rhythm as to bloodshed. Combat has always flirted with choreography. Movements weren't random flails of panic, but patterns, advances, retreats, spins, thrusts, performed with a precision that could look unsettlingly like dance. The Aztec flower wars were staged with such elaborate rhythm that Spaniards watching them thought they'd stumbled into a festival rather than a battlefield. Blades clashed in tempo, bodies circled, and every feint seemed less an accident of adrenaline than a step in some grim ballet. Even in Europe, knights trained with exercises called dances of swords, rehearsing footwork until the fight became as fluid as a court performance. Manuals from the Middle Ages described combat in terms of beats and measures, as if the sword were a violin bow and blood its inevitable music. Samurai duels too often ended with one decisive stroke, a finale that looked almost theatrical in its restraint. A single note struck so perfectly that silence itself became part of the score. But the real rhythm came from within the body. In the heat of combat, adrenaline pushed fighters past ordinary consciousness into something uncomfortably close to ecstasy. Ancient writers compared it to madness, but modern readers would recognize trance states, heart hammering, vision narrowing, time stretching until each breath felt stolen from eternity. Berserkers, frothing and howling, were terrifying, not because they ignored fear, but because they seemed to have stepped out of humanity altogether. Death itself joined the dance. To watch an enemy stagger and fall wasn't only a tactical relief, it was the closing gesture of a ritual sequence, the end of a phrase. Many cultures compared this moment to theater's final bow, the limp body becoming both performer and offering. The ecstasy wasn't only in survival, but in the strange intoxication of seeing violence transformed into form. And if battle was a dance, then warriors weren't merely dancers. They were closer to priests, officiating through motion, their steps consecrating the space where the sacred and the lethal met. If the battlefield resembled a shrine and fighting resembled a dance, then warriors stood less as killers and more as officiants. They weren't merely swinging steel or hurling spears. They were conducting ceremonies where blood was incense and death was the hymn. In many societies, warriors weren't a separate class from priests at all. They blurred, doubled, or alternated the roles depending on the season. Take the Ikinga cults in Igbo tradition. A warrior's strength was both physical and spiritual, his victories consecrated with ritual offerings. Among the Norse, warrior bands like the Elfhauna were not only fighters but initiates of Odin, dressed in animal skins to embody the god's wild frenzy. Their violence was a liturgy, a way of communing with a deity who demanded courage as prayer. Even medieval Christian knights framed themselves as milites Christi, soldiers of Christ, who turned the slaughter of Saracens into the performance of a sacrament. Many warrior societies had secret orders, the dog soldiers of the Cheyenne, the leopard men in West Africa, the ancient Spartans. Membership wasn't just about military skill but about ritual knowledge, oaths, and sacrifices that bound fighters into something closer to monastic brotherhoods. A spear thrust was as much a right as a kill. The warrior's authority came not from sheer brutality but from a sense of divine commission. To be initiated as a fighter was a kind of ordination. Hair was cut, scars inflicted, substances ingested, the same procedures that accompanied priesthood elsewhere. Once transformed, the warrior became a walking threshold, mediating between human and divine through acts of controlled violence. The gods didn't come down to earth to fight. After all, they worked through the bodies of those sworn to kill in their name, and when those bodies finally fell, death was never simple erasure. The warrior's passing was framed as elevation, his corpse treated not as loss but as offering a passage that led straight into the next world, where blood spilled was only the beginning. For warriors, death was rarely thought of as an ending. It was more like a door swinging open, a passage stamped with blood instead of ink. In Homer's verses, fallen heroes weren't merely corpses. They were escorted to Hades with honors, their armor burned or buried, as if to accompany them on the journey. The Norse promised Valhalla, a hall where mead never ran dry and battles repeated endlessly, a paradise built on the rhythm of death and resurrection. To fall with a sword in hand was less tragedy than promotion. In Japan, the ideal of the Bushido code demanded death with dignity, preferably in battle, but even by self-inflicted blade, if honor required. Such deaths weren't shameful. They were cleansing acts, departures that polished the soul for its next appointment. In parts of West Africa, fallen warriors were often buried within the walls of the community they defended, their bones literally strengthening the foundation of village life. The body's decay became a kind of architecture, holding the living in place. Even among the Maya, captives sacrificed in ritual combat were not disgraced, but honored as essential intermediaries. Their death in staged fights echoed into the cosmos, ensuring rains, fertility, or the balance of seasons. To die with blood spilled on consecrated ground was to be rewritten from person into symbol. Grief, of course, was still present. Mothers wailed, comrades mourned. But behind the tears was a script everyone understood. The dead fighter had not vanished. He had been absorbed into story, myth, or genealogy, his essence carried in chants, songs, and festivals. His body lay silent, but his spirit was drafted into the eternal militia that fought not in fields of mud but in the invisible wars of gods. And if warriors became symbols in death, so too did their enemies. For the one who fell was not just a rival defeated, but a mirror sacrificed, a reflection that made the survivor's own life meaningful by contrast. No warrior ever stood entirely alone, for meaning required an opposite. The enemy was not simply a body to be broken, but a reflection, a necessary shadow that gave violence its shape. To face another fighter was to confront a mirror terrifying, distorted, but essential. Without that mirror, the act of killing dissolved into senseless cruelty. With it, the strike became sacrifice. Among the Plains tribes of North America, warriors sometimes counted coup, not by killing but by touching an enemy with a decorated stick, a gesture that recognized the other's courage even while humiliating him. It was acknowledgement. You matter, because without you my bravery cannot exist. In the Homeric epics, dying heroes are given speeches lamentations of their lineage, their worth delivered by the very men who killed them. The slayer narrated the slain into history, ensuring that the opponent was remembered, not erased. The Aztecs, too, treated captives as precious, not disposable. The enemy's blood was required to nourish gods. Therefore, the foe was less an adversary than a collaborator in the cosmic economy. The blade may have been sharp, but it cut along the grain of necessity. Even the Romans, pragmatic as they were, built triumphal arches inscribed with the names of defeated peoples, ironically granting the enemy immortality carved in stone. Killing, then, was rarely framed as elimination. It was communion by destruction, a way of binding self and other in a single gesture. The warrior who struck down a rival didn't obliterate him. He absorbed him, carrying fragments of his essence like spiritual shrapnel. The mirror cracked, yes, but the reflection remained. And once enemies became mirrors, war itself ceased to be a one-time disaster. It became cyclical, woven into the turning of seasons, reenacted so that this dialogue of shadows and reflections would never truly end. No warrior ever stood entirely alone, for meaning required an opposite. The enemy was not simply a body to be broken, but a reflection, a necessary shadow that gave violence its shape. To face another fighter was to confront a mirror, terrifying, distorted, but essential. Without that mirror, the act of killing dissolved into senseless cruelty. With it, the strike became sacrifice. Among the Plains tribes of North America, warriors sometimes countered coup, not by killing but by touching an enemy with a decorated stick, a gesture that recognized the other's courage even while humiliating him. It was acknowledgement. You matter, because without you my bravery cannot exist. In the Homeric epics, dying heroes are given speeches, lamentations of their lineage, their worth delivered by the very men who killed them. The slayer narrated the slain into history, ensuring that the opponent was remembered, not erased. The Aztecs, too, treated captives as precious, not disposable. The enemy's blood was required to nourish gods. Therefore, the foe was less an adversary than a collaborator in the cosmic economy. The blade may have been sharp, but it cut along the grain of necessity. Even the Romans, pragmatic as they were, built triumphal arches inscribed with the names of defeated peoples, ironically granting the enemy immortality carved in stone. Killing, then, was rarely framed as elimination. It was communion by destruction, a way of binding self and other in a single gesture. The warrior who struck down a rival didn't obliterate him. He absorbed him, carrying fragments of his essence like spiritual shrapnel. The mirror cracked, yes, but the reflection remained. And once enemies became mirrors, war itself ceased to be a one-time disaster. It became cyclical, woven into the turning of seasons, reenacted so that this dialogue of shadows and reflections would never truly end.